This is Meg Riley in Minnesota, where it's finally cold and snowy, as it should be, although I whined about global warming on Monday when it was 60. Secretly, I really did enjoy that. But now it's 5, so I'm in Minnesota. Jessica, where are you?
I am in sunny Seattle. No, not really sunny, but I really wanted to say that today. And I am on Twitter with hashtag the VUU. I am taking questions in our YouTube chat, and I'm on Facebook. So you can catch me all over the place this morning.
That's great. And Michael Tino has brought in our special guest this morning. I'm going to turn it over to Michael for some leadership. But Michael, how are you today?
I'm doing okay. It is actually a bright sunny day here in Peekskill, New York. It is no longer unseasonably warm here either, though. Oddly, the roses in front of my house are blooming. Thank you, climate change. And Aisha has joined us, so we should probably let her introduce herself before we introduce our guest. It's good to see you again, Aisha.
I know. Good morning. My dogs won't poop on command, and I was running late this morning, and so my bad. I am Aisha Hauser. I'm in Seattle, Washington, with 2 dogs that are just not, they don't listen as well as I'd like them to.
So before we do, I do want to give a shout out to folks in California. I think we're all watching those fires with grief and horror and all kinds of other feelings, and just may you be safe, may you breathe well, may you get out of danger's way, and may we all rise to the occasion to help you out. So with that, I pass it off to Michael. I'm excited about today's show.
Thank you, Meg. It's good to see you. It's good to see Ian. Our guest today is Ian Lekus, who, full disclosure, I've known Ian since roughly 1983. When I was in 7th grade and he was in 8th grade. So he counts as probably my oldest friend that I've known for a long time. And in honor of International Human Rights Day, we thought it would be an interesting show to talk about international LGBTQ human rights. Ian is the LGBT thematic specialist for Amnesty International USA, and the founder of RadioFreeQTopia, which I'm going to let Ian describe more. So welcome, Ian.
All right. Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you so much, everybody at The VUU. It's a pleasure to be here. It's it's fun to be on the other side of the microphone, since as a podcast host, I'm usually the one asking the questions. But yes, I launched RadioFreeQTopia early this year as a way to talk about LGBTQ issues around the world, and sort of to promote the voices of grassroots activists, educators, artists, other people working to create positive change to make our communities more LGBTQ affirming and inclusive. And we're about 10 episodes in. I will be having another episode in honor of International Human Rights Day, which is observed this weekend. The episode will come out on Monday. But yeah, it's great to be here and to talk about not only the podcast, but about where we are in the situation for LGBTQI people all around the world.
Excellent. So, maybe we should start by having you tell us a little bit about what brought you to do international LGBTQ human rights. Because our folks don't know you. I know you, but our folks don't. So maybe tell us a little bit about how you got to this project.
Sure. And, without spending the next, 50 minutes on the journey, since I could easily do that, or more, in some sense, the story starts even before, around not long after we met, more, roughly after Pangea broke apart. But as a teenager back in the 80s, I was, really inspired by the work of Amnesty International. I was, like many teens that day, sort of drawn into its human rights work by the huge rock concerts, with the Springsteens, the Tracy Chapmans, the Peter Gabriels, the U2, and so on, that were bringing attention to prisoners of conscience, to the people imprisoned on account of their political activity around the world. This is also deep in towards the end of apartheid, and causes like getting Nelson Mandela out of prison and ending apartheid. And in many ways, that crystallized, a lifetime committed to people working for social justice. telling their stories. Along the way, I went to graduate school. I became a professor studying US and world history, social movements, and LGBT studies, looking at how do we create change? How do we make change around the world? And how do we do that from the grassroots up and from the policy top down? Without going through every twist and turns of my academic life, passionate about the work, passionate about the students I got to work with, passionate about the amazing activists I got to interview in the course of my research. And I'm finishing a book on how gay liberation and lesbian feminism come out of other progressive movements of the 60s. More and more my passions for doing this work hands-on, just came back with a driving force. And so moved to Washington, D.C. We got to talk about where we are. I'm sitting here just outside of D.C. in McLean, Virginia at the moment. And having been an on and off Amnesty member for all these years, I got back involved with Amnesty. And Amnesty is a global organization, the oldest human rights organization in the world. In the 90s, it began working on LGBT issues, continues to work on LGBTI issues to this day. And I'm going to talk about some of those issues over the course of our interview. But the thing that particularly excites me about Amnesty's mission and connects with my own life is how important stories are to social change work, to be able to put a personal face on much broader structural issues. So that when we're talking about, we saw this here in the US, and I'm presuming that the majority of your listeners are US based, with the marriage equality campaign, where once people are like, oh, that's, Mary and Sue down the block, once that's Joe and Steve down the block, it was a whole lot easier to sort of wrap your mind and your heart around marriage equality than sort of to talk about abstract legal rights. And as I've thought about where to go with all this, I decided to sort of bring my past and my own future together by launching this podcast dedicated to promoting the stories of change makers around the world. And to get beyond the idea that it's all happening in DC, New York, San Francisco, London, etc.
So thank you. So maybe we should hear some of those stories to start off with. I'd love to have you describe it. It's the website RadioFreeQTopia.com is posted on our link, and we hope that our listeners will go and explore and listen to the 10 episodes that you've had so far. But to entice them to do so, maybe you could tell us about one or two of your favorite interviews.
Sure. And I'll do so prefacing it with the fact that this kind of, we're at this point where we've got a world in motion. We've got, majority of your listeners are sitting here in the US, but you probably have listeners in, several different continents. Ideas are in motion, people are in motion, it is a very small world in many ways. For both, for better and for worse, for the progress we're making and for the way our opponents are learning from each other and using tactics to attack not only LGBTQI people, but sort of civil society democracy more generally. So in terms of the interviews I've done, and that sort of gets this across how we're making huge progress and facing huge challenges at the same time. Even in the last 24 hours, 48 hours, both Australia and Austria have basically introduced marriage equality. And marriage equality is not the be-all and end-all.
Let's just take a moment and say yay about that. We have to really celebrate victories right now. Yay!
Exactly. And we're making progress with, say, trans rights in places, of all, might not expect this, but, some of the pioneers in introducing trans-inclusive legislation have been, Argentina and Malta, not the first two places most of us think about for leading the movement. But again, I mentioned how talking about putting a personal face on this. One interview I did, this fall was with Irene, an intersex activist in Moscow. Irene has an amazing article on BuzzFeed. You can find it. If somebody Googles Irene and BuzzFeed and intersex, you should be able to find the BuzzFeed story. But it's basically about how reading about intersex activists here in the US changed her life, gave her language to understand her own life and to sort of find a way to talk about, what she understood, like her own body in ways that she never did before. And she's co-founded a group called Intersex Russia, small organization, as you might imagine, but nonetheless doing some really remarkable work to educate Russians, other Russian-speaking peoples about intersex issues. At the same time, it's really interesting to find out that it's a whole lot easier to talk about this in English, because English becomes the common language of the global LGBTI movement. But if you ever feel isolated sitting here in DC or Seattle or New York, talking with activists in Moscow, in Kampala, Uganda, in San Salvador, but part of the good news of the world right now is that you have, groups of activists in almost every corner. Sometimes they're under siege. I've got a tough interview coming up. I haven't published it yet. I'm going to probably save it for right after New Year's, just because people are distracted this time of the year. But with a really remarkable Bangladeshi activist who has had to leave the country because of the violence committed against LGBT people, against professors, novelists, bloggers, other sort of leaders of civil society in Bangladesh at the moment. And that, the violence is coming from an Islamist movement where basically ISIS related, and it is tremendously dangerous. So, right now he's seeking asylum in Stockholm, in Sweden, and we did a really remarkable interview. It's a tough one. 2 of his dear friends were murdered by the Islamists. This is not easy stuff, and this is part of the broad attack on civil society we're seeing. So that one isn't yet up on the website, but keep an eye out for that. Again, probably coming out right after New Year's, post-holidays. But exciting.
Another one, can I ask a question? Because, with our own human rights violator in high office here, I'm really concerned about my queer Muslim friends who are here from other countries. And I know they're concerned for themselves and each other as well. And I wonder what you're seeing. I mean, are people leaving here and going to European countries? Are we hoping we're going to fend off some of the worst here? I mean, these travel bans that send people back to places like you just described are terrifying for some people.
Absolutely. I would, first of all, to get back to one of the early questions, if you want to get an introduction, I would take a listen to the very first episode, my interview with my friend Aruj Arshad, who is a Pakistani-American activist working for an amazing nonprofit, Advocates for Youth. She came here to the country, as a, I want to say, late single digits, early teen years, but just sort of doing amazing work for LGBTI rights, for reproductive justice, for fighting both homophobia and Islamophobia. And so to get to your question, part of the kind of world in motion we're seeing is more and more of a network of LGBTQI Muslims and their allies, and sort of combating both those who are secular Muslims, but culturally Muslim, as well as those who are very much practicing, and more finding allies. We've got, and the fact that, even though I already have referred to the victories for marriage equality and have interviewed people involved with the Taiwanese and Chilean marriage equality campaigns, let's not pretend that that's the be-all and end-all of the battle for LGBTQI justice, and that the, sort of, I want to be very careful in talking about a real threat of Islamists against, and distinguishing that from, blanket Islamophobia as promoted by Donald Trump and many other policymakers and outright bigots.
Well, and I think, Aisha, go ahead.
I have a couple things. One is I was raised, I'm Egyptian. I was born in Egypt and I was raised Muslim. And there is culturally a problem with deep ingrained homophobia within, especially, within Islam itself. And I know there's liberal Muslims. I know that. And I also know that it's really just as entrenched as it is in the Christian evangelical movement. And so it's heartening and inspiring to see gay Muslim activists who are fighting against that. But I actually have a question about what's going on. I believe it's in Chechnya. where gay men, I believe, are being rounded up, and I feel so helpless, and I'm really wanting to ask, what and how can what can folks do who aren't there to bring light, attention? Is it being exaggerated? Is it even worse? Do you know what I'm talking about? Or, I see snippets of it on my Facebook feed.
Yep. I'm deeply involved with it, both through Amnesty International, and I wanted, just for our readers to be clear, my Amnesty work and my podcast work are separate, though they clearly inform each other. But in terms of the crisis in Chechnya, if you're, for those who aren't familiar, over the last roughly 12 months, it appears to have begun around last December, Chechen authorities began a roundup of gay men and a few trans women, imprisoning at least 100. The Russian LGBT network is doing remarkable work to document what's going on, to help get people out of Chechnya, either to other parts of the Russian Federation or out of Russia altogether. Again, Chechnya is still part of the Russian Federation, even though it's highly autonomous. The network's best research is that at least 15 people have been killed in this, what's effectively an anti-queer pogrom, but a state-sponsored one. Dozens more injured. Many people have disappeared, have fled to sort of try and escape, because one of the real problems is extrajudicial violence, so that people are not only being killed by the Chechen state, but also quote unquote honor killings, where the LGBTQ people are being accused of bringing shame to the family name, and sort of families take matters into their own hands. So it's sort of it's a case study of the ways that state violence and extrajudicial violence go hand in hand. We also see worrying signs of this potentially being on the horizon in Azerbaijan and Tajikistan, but it's certainly most extensively, clearly happening in Chechnya. This is more generally, the crisis is not exaggerated. If anything, it's a bit underplayed. Some of what I have to hold back on saying publicly, I know from my Russian colleagues who don't want to bring too much attention to the crisis, but I will just briefly say that it's not only gay men, it's not only trans women, but that it's, in fact, saying more than that might actually put people in further danger. In terms of the sense of what we can do, Amnesty is famous for, write letters. Does writing letters to Vladimir Putin, does writing letters to the Russian, Chechen warlord Kadyrov make a difference? Mostly, no. But Putin does seem to have been surprised by the level of outrage to this, and seems to have put some pressure for an investigation. It's an open debate right now whether the investigation being led by Russia's ombudsperson is genuinely independent or not. There's more reason to be optimistic than one would expect, but not tons of reason, if that makes sense. It's not only a puppet show. If your listeners want to do something concrete, I would support the work of Rainbow Railroad, which is a Toronto-based organization, and it's www.rainbowrailroad.ca, that is doing amazing work. They've actually been doing amazing work for 5 to 10 years. My second interview was with Kamali Powell, the executive director of Rainbow Railroad, and they've been working to get LGBTQ refugees out of all sorts of countries, out of the Caribbean, out of Jamaica, out of Uganda, out of Syria, and to Canada for safety. And since last December, especially since last April, they've been working with the Canadian government to specifically help Chechens get out of the country. Again, some of the details have to be cautious, because there's still, Chechens who even get out of Russia are still concerned about violence coming from the broader Chechen diaspora. But the Canadian, it's at this point, it's now public knowledge that Rainbow Railroad and the Trudeau administration in Canada have partnered on this, and that a couple dozen people have, in fact, been resettled from Chechnya to Canada. That much I can publicly say. And their work, and if you support rainbowrailroad.ca, you're also supporting their work to get LGBT refugees out of the Syrian war zone, or out of Jamaica, out of East Africa, and so I think to Bangladesh. And so the second interview with Kamali Powell, the ED of Rainbow Railroad, you'll definitely learn a lot more about their work. It's a great organization. So it doesn't necessarily solve what's happening, but it helps real people get to safety and to get support services for finding work, being able to support yourself, being able to have a functional life on your own once you're in a unfamiliar country where not many people are speaking Chechen.
Ian, I'm curious, you're looking at this really hard stuff all the time. Where do you get spiritual support for it? We often wait till the end of the show for this, but I feel like today I need it now to go on. So, where do you find the strength to keep talking to people with such incredible stories? And I know some of it comes from them, but I'm just curious what spiritual practices you have, what kind of support you're leaning on yourself for this work.
Does reading Michael's Facebook wall count as a spiritual practice? I dare say it does. Michael has watched my religious journey.
I didn't say religious, I said spiritual, but go ahead.
They're good reasons. Unlike a whole lot of people I encounter, I was raised by militant atheists, which, certainly led me to a very different, I am basically a red diaper grandbaby. One set of grandparents were little C communists, too independent to ever join any official organization, but nonetheless, American radicals devoted to economic justice in particular. Since, in the 30s and 40s, that's how they were talking about it, or at least how we would resemble it. Not necessarily intersectionality wasn't in their language yet, is basically what I'm saying. Parents, were involved with anti-war activism during the Vietnam era, civil rights. And so, I kind of was destined or doomed, depending on your point of view, to some version of this track. But I also had to sort of, found my own path away from what was effectively, the new atheism, of, the Richard Dawkins types of the modern era long before it was a thing. And becoming an academic made me sort of think about spirituality in new ways, but like what do we take on faith and what do we consider evidence? And certainly watching Michael's path from, since I remember Michael as a scientist, to his involvement in his growing faith community with UU certainly spurred my own thinking in many ways and my own feeling. So at this point, I've certainly had a circuitous journey, to say the very least, but getting at the core of your question, the energy and optimism of these activists, no matter the cost, no matter the context, is extraordinary. I did an interview with Andrea Ayala, an El Salvadoran lesbian activist, ED, executive director of El Salvador's Esmuelas, roughly lesbian space for diversity. And El Salvador has one of the very highest murder rates in the world. Much of that violence is directed at women, at LGBT people, trans people in particular, basically gender nonconforming people. Certainly a number of leading activists have been murdered there, as well as in nearby Honduras. And if there's somebody who would think would be anxious or nervous, it would be her. And instead, just the unrelenting optimism of the community that she's part of, every step forward is energizing. And there's this, it really does help with, good Lord, the last year has been grinding and exhausting. And just the kind, and being here in DC is both the best and the worst of that. I was online at Dunkin' Donuts this morning before, coming here, and the "Make America Great" hat, just sent my blood pressure soaring. Of course, you also step back and look at this particular person, and it's in a Dunkin' Donuts where pretty much the entire rest of the clientele or staff are Latino, are Asian American, are Arab American. It is an odd place to be a United Nations of the modern society, and in fact, Northern Virginia is one of the grand surprises of this, is just how spectacularly diverse a region this is. And so, if anything, he's the "Make America Great Again" guy is the anomaly. But it speaks to sort of having to cultivate a sense of presence, of mindfulness, of who is around us and who is actually making things better in all sorts of ways. That's a long roundabout and not institutionally based answer to your question, but there you go.
I would love. Oh, go ahead, Meg.
Oh, I heard you say it's the activists themselves and their strength that feeds you, and that's kind of what I thought you'd say, but I just was curious.
I would say that's, yeah. I mean, it's, and I think other people have told me that I do that for them. It's not always easy for me to see that. I think we're always our worst. We know our own demons. But the kind of way that we support each other is so essential to this work, and that it makes the fact, an era of Trump and Putin and Brexit and CC and a whole bunch of others, I'm not going to say bearable, but there are ways to negotiate and survive and actually grow.
Thank you for that. I wanted to go back to threading the needle of so I the first time I even heard of Muslim gay activists at all was with Arshad Manji's book, The Trouble with Islam, and I was fortunate enough to meet her at a book signing, and what I found remarkable is that she still wanted to. I left the Muslim faith. I was threatened with honor killings. My husband's Jewish. I'm not gay, but I married someone out of the faith, and so yeah. And so I was disowned by my family, and I really wanted. I was bitter about it, and I left the faith, and I identify as Unitarian right now, but so I've had healing to do with that. But what I found inspiring and remarkable, to your point, that it's the activist, is she was able to still embrace what she saw as the good in the faith. And I think the needle for me that's threading is there's still the reality of deep-rooted homophobia, because I believe that what's driving the Chechen, like you said, I think is the Islamists and what ISIS is doing. And so how does that needle get thread without stoking homophobia and still embrace and affirm what's good? I guess I'm just asking for myself, because I haven't been able to reconcile that. So I'm curious what you found.
No, that's a good question. How do I also talk about what's happening in Egypt or Bangladesh or Chechnya without stoking Islamophobia? And that's So the interview that I'm coming out with on Monday is with Jessica Stern, the executive director of Outright Action International, which is one of the two oldest LGBTQI human rights organizations in the world, and they're awesome. And I basically raised that question to her because clearly, we have to be intersectional, at all points. One thing I particularly want to talk about with, because it's so easy to slip it either into Islamophobia or, de facto racism about, African people of Africans in particular, and we see this as well. We're talking about African American, quote unquote African American homophobe, which is neither non-existent nor the phenomenon that's often talked about. That so much of, to take Egypt, to take Chechnya, these are so opportunistic, and for that matter, this also applies to Putin and Russian Orthodox Church, that this is about attacking freedom. This is about attacking people's ability to determine their lives in their own ways. That I don't think that Vladimir Putin gives one whit, positive or negatively, about LGBTQ issues. what basically Putin is doing, and I'm going to sort of circle back around to your question directly, is, queer people are the modern day Jews of what Russia has traditionally done. Russia has moved on. I'm not going to say that. I am not going to say that anti-Semitism is gone from Russia. God knows what we're seeing in the United States with anti-Semitism is deeply disturbing and sort of a break with at least polite conversation in the last 75 years. But the kind of, instead of choosing to attack Jews as the threat to Russia, we're attacking LGBTQ people as the threat. And so in the same way, LGBTQ people become the vulnerable minority in Uganda, in Egypt, in Chechnya, elsewhere. It's easy. We're an easy target. Moreover, it's in the case of anywhere in the world that was colonized, it's a really remarkable way to attack the United States and Britain is to associate the West with LGBTQ human rights and to sort of say this is a Western thing. Now, we know perfectly well that sexual diversity and gender identity, sexual and gender diversity have millennia of history across the world. But the LGBT, the rainbow flag is actually from the West. Some of the ways we talk about sexual and gender diversity are actually pretty Western. The professional language is often about sexual orientation, gender identity expression, and intersex characteristics, rather than LGBT, specifically because the initialism comes out of the West. Now, this sounds like it's awfully academic debate. But even if sexual diversity, to take Uganda, or actually better to take Egypt, because the current case in Egypt is probably the largest crisis at the moment for LGBTQ people around the world. There was a case earlier this fall with one concert goer just raising a rainbow flag, and this prompted a huge crackdown and imprisonment of hundreds of people. The flag was designed in San Francisco. The flag was promoted.
I didn't even know that. Can you just, I feel like, how did I not even hear that? So somebody was at a concert, lifted up a rainbow flag, and then who got rounded up? People at the concert or other people?
It started with the concert, but it sort of has become something, people being arrested in public, in some private spaces, homes and restaurants and clubs and such. Before the revolution, before the Arab Spring, in the early 2000s, there was a first wave of anti-LGBT repression by the then Mubarak regime, and most infamously, the arrest of 52 men on a cruise boat in the Nile, the River Queen, and sort of the kind of imprisonment and the harassment, the violence against imprisoned people. And just more generally, under Mubarak and now under the Sisi regime, that you've got extensive violence by police and incarcerated prison officials. Egypt is still one of the countries that uses "quote unquote" anal testing to prove quotation marks, a man or a trans woman's homosexual behavior. Again, complicated terminology around, but basically sort of as if that this is some kind of evidence, as if there's not the slightest bit of validity to this scientifically. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have extensively documented the use of anal testing in Uganda, in Tunisia, in Egypt, other countries as well. Some countries are beginning to take moves against this, but Egypt is so far steadfast in continuing its physical abuse of detainees and incarcerated people.
Egypt's had so this is where I was born. When I was in the early 90s in New York City, I went to Hunter College for an MSW, and I was mortified to hear from a professor. She said, I was on a World AIDS panel, and I don't know why they had a doctor from Egypt, but they did. And the doctor from Egypt said in front of this group of people, we have no AIDS in Egypt because we have no gay people in Egypt. So this is the attitude. And then now I guess and I really appreciate your point about this is a targeting freedom, really. And I think reframing that is helpful for me, because then it can be, we can target the system, and that's for me a helpful way to thread that needle. But Egypt's, and also what Egypt is doing is going after bloggers, who are writing about LGBTIQ issues. And so they're really, really notorious. And part of what Egypt's issue is, I'm just going to introduce, I wish there was like an Arabic OWL, Our Whole Lives, the sex ed program, because it is a really unhealthy sexual, not just Egypt, but how the Arab cultures in terms of how repressed sexually everybody is. And so there's high rates of incest, high rates of, and so the homophobia also comes out of just not being a sexually healthy people, if that makes sense. And I know I'm generalizing, so yeah.
And Ian, you talk about the difficulties in organizing what folks in the United States might call LGBT people, but in other parts of the world because of the legacy of colonialism. And of course, part of the irony is that some of the most heinous anti-queer things that we're seeing in places like Africa are being egged on by U.S.-based evangelical Christians. So are you encountering people who are like working in that kind of space too?
I mean, I'm not running into them in my direct daily life, but yes, they're there. And that American evangelicals are very active across sub-Saharan Africa, in Russia, in the Baltics, basically across the former Soviet bloc, promoting, basically the decision that they have lost the culture war, quote unquote, at home, and so are exporting, homophobia. Political research organizations, a tiny think tank in Somerville, Massachusetts, has done extraordinary research on the role that American evangelicals, such as Scott Lively, who is based, in Western Massachusetts, have done, the work they've done to both promote hatred and to actually get things like Uganda's 2011 Anti-Homosexuality Act passed. So it's both cultural hatred and trying to get legal changes made specifically against LGBTI people. So this is ongoing. This is not in any way abated. Political Research and Associates has done some great work. Human Rights Campaign has also put out some research in the last year or two. I used both organizations' research. I taught a class on LGBT human rights a couple of years ago, and the research from both organizations is pretty strong. But yeah, that this is a faith-based campaign of hate.
Yeah, I'll put in a plug for Political Research Associates. Back when I got obsessed with the right years ago, I spent about a year just sitting in there reading it was then books, their whole library on anti-gay stuff to figure out what was going on. They're wonderful people. I'll just lift them up. So you're kind of an independent person and you create these stories, this podcast, and then where do you feel like it goes? I mean, so you tell them, and then have you heard stories about how those stories ripple out? Because I agree with you that, Michael and I, we're ENFPs. We think stories are the way to truth, right? but how do you get from, the anecdote to policy or to action or to move? It's kind of the question we're asking about the Me Too. How does it really become a strategic movement? So how do you think these stories are best leveraged?
It's a great question. And in terms of the podcast specifically, I'm still figuring that out. Year one was to get off the ground. Year two is sort of to try and refine some of that and to sort of build more of a listener community. All the more reason to be grateful for this opportunity to talk about the podcast. I think what it goes into, have I frozen? Sorry. Okay, no. I just wanted to make sure because suddenly it was just sort of so still. It was like, wait a second. And our Wi-Fi can be a little shaky at times. Anyway, that it's easy to romanticize stories. It's easy to sort of say that they're kind of, that they'll sort of like automatically follow to positive, productive, progressive change. So I'm looking for more and more opportunities where I can blend the storytelling with, here are ways to actually affect policy. I'm going to be running a workshop at Creating Change, the LGBTQ activist conference run by the National LGBTQ Task Force. It'll be next month in DC, you know, connecting the stories, connecting what's going on to lobbying policymakers, to, you know, contacting local officials, consulate officials, etc. Part of the power of storytelling is getting people invested in these stories, and sort of like, how do we go beyond this is my family member, this is my neighbor. It's a starting point. It gets people in. But how do we then sort of use that as to then start speaking for people we don't actually know? It's an open question. It's a hard question. But I do think, you know, certainly one of the things that I have seen with, you know, and this gets back to where I draw my strength and activists drawing strength from each other, is the importance of the kind of conferences, the kinds of meeting spaces, the convenings where people can trade their stories and sort of have not only inspiration from each other, but practical tools. And figuring out what works in a local context. I mean, it's remarkable that on the pro-LGBTQI side of things, one of our great exports has been the PFLAG model, and that we see either under direct partnership with PFLAG National in the USA or looser collaborations, that model of family and friends supporting LGBTQ people in South Africa, in Poland and Ukraine, in China. I am working to try and get an interview with the head of PFLAG China. To say the least, that is something I really would love to bring to my listeners, and to sort of see what is it from the US experience that does and does not translate literally and figuratively both in the People's Republic of China. PFLAG is founded in the early 70s. At this point, PFLAG is the name of the organization, but PFLAG was originally Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, and so it's, you know, its membership has at pflag.org. It has very much was founded by, you know, the mother of a gay male son, who was not going to stand up. Is not going to stand for what her son was facing, and it has become a national and indeed a global movement. I have to, you know, shout out to my mom, who was a board member of PFLAG in Western Massachusetts before she moved to the DC area 2 years ago. But the you know, they do remarkable work, often at the very local levels, but sometimes sort of affecting state and national policy. Much of their work these days in the U.S. is based on, you know, supporting trans youth and making schools in particular safer places for trans and gender nonconforming young people.
Thank you for that. So I hope you get an interview with this person in China, and as you know, anyone who's paying attention knows probably interviews with activists in China are going to become a rare thing, given that their government is cracking down on VPNs and all the ways in which people in China actually get connected through the internet to places outside of China. Again, part of this whole how we control freedom.
Absolutely.
So I hope you get that. I'm interested in something you said early on in our talk, and I don't know how much there is to say about it, or how much you might know about it or be connected to people about it. You mentioned Argentina as a place of hope regarding trans-inclusive policies, and it struck me in particular because we're just a few weeks out from the Transgender Day of Remembrance, and for those who honor that every year, part of the day is looking and reading the lists of transgender and gender nonconforming people around the world who have been killed, murdered because of who they are, and the list from Argentina was quite long, and not quite as long as the list from Brazil, but the list from Argentina was quite long, and so I'm interested if there is that much violence going on, that there's also hope, that there's a story of hope also. So I'm wondering more about what that story of hope is.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a couple of things that come to mind as I listen to your question. Had I continued with a traditional academic route, I might well have dived into this more directly, more deeply, because one of the things that's fascinating to me is how the societies that had to wrestle with coming out of dictatorship, be it South African apartheid or the military dictatorships in Latin America, and really wrestled with what does it mean to have a democratic society, have been remarkable. I mean, there were 4 or 5 countries in Latin America that had marriage equality before the United States did. We're not actually, those of us in the United States are not actually at the front of the line. We're number 20 or 21, depending on how you count. And this includes not only LGBT, marriage equality, it includes Argentina's transgender inclusive law, trans law, making it much easier to change your gender identity legally, to get documents, et cetera, to really sort of the day-to-day stuff that those of us who are cisgender take for granted until you actually have to change your gender markers. This also includes, Brazil making HIV meds, easily accessible and sort of declaring that health care is in fact a human right. These are all part and parcel of the same cluster of issues. What is really remarkable when we look, if you look at the reports coming, from the National Center for Transgender Equality, from Argentina itself, Latin America itself, from Trans Europe, from ILGA in Europe, it looks like Latin America is the worst place in the world to be trans because of the violence against transgender women, both from the state and especially extrajudicial killings. What's remarkable is how these societies sort of sit at an intersection, that the movement for trans rights, for LGBTQ rights more generally, is actually strong enough to count, to do the recording. We're not getting, the numbers don't compare in sub-Saharan Africa, the former Soviet Union, other parts of the world, not because the violence isn't happening, but because the movements aren't large enough to document them systemically. And so even the kind of violence that's happening in Latin America, horrible to say in some sense, is a sign of the fact that we have movements with the capacity to not forget the people, to count at least a large number of the, a significant number of the victims. We don't have that capacity yet in large swaths of the world.
I lived in Cartagena, Colombia for 2 years. And what was really fascinating for me is there was I'm sure there's plenty of trans people, but the one that a neighbor of mine had talked about was a salon hairdresser. And she was very certainly it wasn't quite, I mean, it's a predominantly Catholic country. However, what she said is, yeah, everyone accepts her and loves her. It's okay. She would shrug her shoulders. So I think I was thinking the same thing you were, that actually, as horrific as it is, and it is horrific, it's that people are seeing trans folks and so that's why the documentation, I think, is happening. But it was very interesting because she, in her own way, my friend was, accepting, and this person was very accepted in the society in Cartagena.
No, I think that's really valuable. And the fact that, a couple of things come to mind as well, that the violence against trans people in Latin America is part and parcel of a broader phenomenon of violence against, especially women and gender nonconforming people, but more generally against the have-nots, broadly speaking. And that this is it's one of the things that sort of the LGBT human rights movement and the broader human rights movement have to wrestle with is sometimes, because of the relative strength, and I don't want to overplay, all of the progress we've made given the strength of the backlash in the United States as well, especially this week with the Supreme Court hearings on the Masterpiece case, and the ominous comments from Anthony Kennedy. The U.S. doesn't, Americans of all orientations don't pay attention to, say, human rights abuses in Gambia in general, but the press will report on the violence against the LGBTQ Gambians. And so it's a card that oppressive regimes can play, is this is all they care about. And hearing this from Gambian gay activists is like, yeah, we're grateful. We really are grateful to sort of have the attention, the spotlight, the condemnation of now former President Yame. But where were all the human rights activists given everybody else who has been killed, imprisoned, etc.? And it's not an unreasonable question, and it's one we have to wrestle with.
It's interesting connecting this violence and these struggles and human rights violations back to American ignorance of the world that we live in. Is a fascinating connection, one that I wouldn't have thought of. I mean, I know that Americans are ignorant of the world that we live in, but that actually feeds violence against people who we might notice.
Right. I mean, we're not noticing violence against poor straight Brazilians or Argentinians, environmental activists in Indonesia, etc. One of the things that has been really useful about my work with Amnesty is just sort of seeing more and more in practice the language of talking about LGBT rights as human rights, that we are talking about fundamental political rights to association, to freedom of religion, to freedom of speech, etc., to economic and social rights, including access to education, access to healthcare, access to sustainable work, because sort of talking, not only emphasizing the basic humanity of sexual and gender minorities, of LGBTQ people or other versions of queerness, but talking about how an attack, building the language to build alliances with broader human rights movements, that were originally pretty cautious to not want to be associated with an unpopular minority. And this gets to some of the questions we were talking about earlier in our conversation and before we went live about the risks that human rights organizations take, that progressive clergy, UU, and other progressive clergy take supporting LGBTQ people. That this is part and parcel of a campaign. Ultimately, whose side are you on? Are you on the side of General Sisi? Are you on the side of Museveni in Uganda, of until recently Mugabe in Zimbabwe? These sort of do the human rights organizations want to support the regime that they oppose in every other way all the time? It also sort of basically becomes a way to talk about intersectionality globally. We're getting better and better. We have a long way to go. I don't want to oversell it. But where we are now versus where we are, we all remember when this conversation hadn't made as much progress as it is now in terms of connections between, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, class, race, gender, onwards. The language of talking about sexual, LGBTQ human rights as fundamental human rights is effectively a global language of intersectionality, of global intersections.
Interesting. So interesting. And those, some of our viewers and listeners might also know part of the story in Uganda hit home for Unitarian Universalists, because part of the violence against LGBT folks in Uganda in particular is one story I know, was also targeted at Unitarian Universalist communities that were forming there because they were a queer-friendly religion. So it wasn't even just that. I mean, just that the very small UU communities in places like Kampala were openly welcoming of LGBT people, and so got swept up in some of the abuses that their regime has been perpetrating.
Right, and this is a question of faith. It's a question of healthcare providers providing basic healthcare services to LGBTQ people, puts them at risk. I mean, the 2011 law I referred to before was struck down, but we sort of see the kind of ways that it's not only LGBTQ people, but their faith leaders, their doctors, their family members, their teachers, etc., who can be at risk. And this is why it's not only attacking an unpopular minority, but a broad attack on freedom, in every sense of the word.
So we have just a couple minutes left. You've mentioned the hope for one future interview, and then a couple of episodes that are in production, ready to getting ready to be released. Are there some interviews that you have lined up that you're particularly excited about that you haven't told us about or that haven't happened yet?
I'm in talks with a bunch of people. As you might imagine, activists have a lot of things on their plate, and talking to some U.S. podcaster, isn't always at the top of their list. But with that in mind, I want to talk with people. I've got specific people in mind from the Caribbean, and particularly talking about life in the Caribbean post hurricanes, to talk with Egypt, people from Egypt, most likely Egyptian asylum seekers. I want to talk with, and this getting back to some of the things we talked about, a digital security expert in the UK who is very active in sort of finding, helping develop and promote tools to keep communities and individuals safe, since one of the crises we have in this age, in an interconnected world, is entrapment, where people either pose, whether police or everyday people, pose as gay to entrap gay men and trans women in particular. So that's a sample of things I'm working on. I've got a much longer list, but.
What's your dream interview?
What? Aisha?
Who is? I'm wondering who your dream interview is.
Oh God, I've got a few, but off the top of my head, I really would love to talk with Masha Gessen, who is a sort of an amazing writer about democracy. Sort of, she and her wife, I first learned about when it was still the Soviet Union, and she has sort of, she and her family have moved, eventually are now U.S. based, but moved back and forth between Russia and the United States for many years, talking about freedom and democracy in general, LGBTQ issues in particular.
Oh, she's one of my favorites. Yeah, she's remarkable. So that's a good one.
That would be.
So if any of our viewers have connections to people doing exciting things in international LGBTQ human rights, or like live next door to Masha Gessen and want to connect you with her, is there a way they can do that on your website? Or
I was going to say Facebook and Twitter are probably the best ways. Both, at RadioFreeQTopia. At RadioFreeQTopia. The website is RadioFreeQTopia.com. But Facebook and Twitter at Radio Free, and then Qtopia is QTOPIA. Utopia, but with a Q.
Yep. And so we're gonna get those links up on our broadcast. So thank you so much. I miss you because you're in DC, so I don't get to see you often. And so it's nice to spend an hour with a dear friend, and to share that hour with the view. Anything final things that you want to say, Aisha?
Yeah, thank you so much. This was so wonderful and rich. And my sister lives in DC, and I may hook you up because she may know activists in Egypt. So I'll send you her info.
Yeah, that would be amazing. Thank you, all of you. Thank you to the four of you. Michael, please send my love to your husband and daughter.
I will do that.
And I look forward to continuing the conversation one way or the other.
So this has been another episode of The VUU, and you who are Masha Gessen's next door neighbor, we expect you to hook her up with Ian for an interview soon. We'll see you next week here on The VUU. Take care, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you.